The rain hammered down on the cardboard shelter with relentless fury, turning the alleyway behind Morrison's department store into a rushing stream of debris and forgotten dreams. 17-year-old Maya huddled deeper into her threadbare coat, watching the water pool around her worn sneakers. She had been living on these streets for 3 years now, ever since the fire that took her foster parents and left her with nothing but questions about who she really was. The small locket around her neck, her only possession from before the foster system, was cold against her skin. She clutched it reflexively, a nervous habit she developed over the years. Through the driving rain, Maya heard something unusual, a sound that didn't belong to the symphony of urban decay she knew so well. It was a groan, weak and desperate, coming from near the dumpster 20 feet away. Her first instinct was to ignore it. The streets had taught her that getting involved meant trouble, and trouble was something she couldn't afford. But the sound came again, more urgent this time, followed by a wet, rattling cough that spoke of serious distress. Against her better judgment, Maya pushed herself up from her makeshift bed and ventured into the downpour. The rain immediately soaked through her coat, but she pressed forward, squinting through the darkness. Near the dumpster, partially hidden by shadows and garbage bags, lay a man in what appeared to be an expensive suit, now ruined by mud and blood. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with silver hair matted to his forehead. His face was pale, almost ghostly, and a dark stain spread across his shirt from somewhere beneath his jacket. Maya's heart raced as she knelt beside him, her hands hovering uncertainly over his body. She had seen people in bad shape before, but something about this man's condition frightened her more than usual. His breathing was shallow and labored, and when his eyes fluttered open briefly, she saw panic and pain reflected in their depths. Without thinking, she pressed her hand against the wound in his side, feeling warm blood seep through her fingers. The man's eyes focused on her face for just a moment, and his lips moved, forming words she couldn't quite hear over the rain. Then his hand reached up, trembling, and gripped her wrist with surprising strength before falling away. Maya knew she had to act fast, or this stranger would die in this forgotten alley, alone in the storm. Maya's mind raced through her limited options as the rain continued to pour down on them both. She couldn't call an ambulance, her phone had been stolen 2 months ago, and she was too far from any store that might let her use their phone at this hour. The nearest hospital was 15 blocks away, impossibly far for someone in this man's condition. But she knew a place closer, a rundown community clinic that operated out of a church basement 3 blocks north. Father Miguel ran it, and though he had little in terms of supplies, he had a kind heart and enough medical knowledge to stabilize someone until proper help could arrive. The decision to help this stranger went against every survival instinct Maya had developed. On the streets, you looked out for yourself first, always. Getting involved with someone else's problems could draw unwanted attention from police, gangs, or worse. She didn't even know what had happened to this man. For all she knew, he could be a criminal, someone dangerous who would bring trouble crashing down on her already precarious existence. But as she looked at his ashen face and felt his weakening pulse beneath her fingers, she couldn't walk away. With effort born of desperation, Maya managed to get the man into a semi-sitting position against the dumpster. He was heavier than he looked and completely unable to support his own weight. She stripped off her coat and pressed it against his wound, then used her belt to secure it in place, a makeshift bandage that she hoped would slow the bleeding. The man groaned but didn't fully regain consciousness, his head lolling against his chest. Maya knew she couldn't carry him, but she might be able to drag him if she could fashion some kind of sled. She found what she needed in the very cardboard that had been her shelter. Working quickly despite her shaking hands, she pulled apart the largest pieces and laid them flat, overlapping them to create a crude but functional surface. With tremendous effort, she rolled the man onto the cardboard, then tied the front edge with a piece of rope she'd been using to secure her belongings. The rain had made the cardboard slick, which would actually help it slide across the pavement. Taking the rope in both hands, Maya began to pull, her feet slipping on the wet ground as she strained against the weight. Every muscle in her thin frame screamed in protest as she dragged the dying man through the dark streets. The blocks seemed endless, and twice she had to stop and check that he was still breathing, terror gripping her heart when she couldn't immediately detect his shallow breaths. People passed by, hurrying through the rain with umbrellas and averted eyes, none stopping to help or even ask what was happening. Maya had become invisible long ago, just another piece of street debris, and tonight that invisibility extended to her desperate burden. When she finally saw the warm lights of St. Catherine's Church ahead, tears of relief mixed with the rain on her face. Father Miguel was locking the church's side entrance when he heard Maya's desperate shout cutting through the storm. He turned to see the bedraggled girl he'd offered meals to countless times, now pulling what appeared to be a body on a makeshift stretcher through the rain. Without hesitation, he rushed down the steps, his elderly frame moving with surprising speed. Together, they managed to get the unconscious man down into the clinic basement, leaving a trail of water and blood across the worn linoleum floor. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, the full extent of the man's injuries became apparent. The wound in his side was deep, likely from a knife, and he'd lost a significant amount of blood. His breathing was dangerously shallow, and his skin had taken on a waxy quality that Father Miguel recognized from his years as a military chaplain. This man was dying, and they had minutes, not hours, to stabilize him. The priest immediately began cutting away the blood-soaked clothing while barking instructions at Maya to fetch supplies from the locked cabinet. Maya moved on autopilot, her hands shaking as she gathered gauze, antiseptic, and the limited medications the clinic possessed. She had helped Father Miguel before with minor injuries, scraped knees, and infected cuts, but never anything like this. The priest worked with practiced efficiency, cleaning and packing the wound before applying pressure to slow the bleeding. He started in 4-line with surprising dexterity, getting fluids into the man's system to combat the shock. All the while, he spoke in a calm, steady voice, as much to reassure Maya as to focus his own thoughts. As they worked, Maya noticed details about their patient that seemed incongruous with finding him bleeding in an alley. His hands, though dirty now, showed signs of regular manicures. The watch still on his wrist, partially hidden by blood, looked expensive, real gold and fine craftsmanship. Even his ruined suit, she could now see, was tailored perfectly to his frame, made from fabric that probably cost more than she'd seen in years. This wasn't some random street person who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time. This was someone important, someone with resources, which made his presence in that alley even more mysterious. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, Father Miguel finally stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow despite the basement's chill. The man's breathing had stabilized somewhat, though he remained unconscious, and the bleeding had slowed to a manageable level. The priest looked at Maya with a mixture of pride and concern. She had saved this man's life by getting him here, but now they faced a difficult decision. This person needed a hospital, needed real doctors and proper care, but involving the authorities would mean questions, lots of questions. For Maya, who avoided official attention at all costs for reasons Father Miguel had never fully understood, this represented a significant danger. Yet the priest also knew that without further medical intervention, their patient might not survive the night, and that burden would weigh on all of them. The man's eyes opened 3 hours later, unfocused and confused, darting around the unfamiliar basement clinic as if searching for threats. Father Miguel had dozed off in a chair nearby, but Maya had remained vigilant, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside the cot, watching the steady rise and fall of the stranger's chest. When his gaze finally settled on her face, she saw a flicker of recognition, though she couldn't imagine where he might know her from. His lips moved, trying to form words, but only a hoarse whisper emerged. Maya quickly offered him water, supporting his head as he took small, painful sips. The simple act seemed to exhaust him, and he fell back against the thin pillow, but his eyes never left her face. There was an intensity to his stare that made her uncomfortable, as if he were trying to memorize her features or solve some puzzle written in her face. Finally, he managed to speak, his voice rough and barely audible. He asked her name, and when she told him, something strange happened. Tears formed in his eyes, and his hand reached out, trembling, to touch her face. Father Miguel stirred awake at the sound of voices and immediately began checking their patient's vital signs. The man's name, they learned, was Richard Thornton, and he was indeed someone important, the CEO of Thornton Industries, a multinational corporation worth billions. He had been attacked leaving a charity gala, stabbed by someone he never saw clearly, and had wandered in shock for several blocks before collapsing in that alley. As he spoke, his voice growing slightly stronger, he kept looking at Maya with that same intense, almost desperate expression. Richard tried to sit up, wincing at the pain in his side, and insisted on speaking with Maya alone. Father Miguel hesitated, protective of the girl he'd come to care for. But something in the man's eyes made him nod and step outside, leaving them in the harsh fluorescent glow of the basement. What Richard said next changed everything Maya thought she knew about herself. He told her about his daughter, Emma, who had disappeared 17 years ago when she was just 6 months old, taken during a home invasion that had killed his wife. The police had never found her, despite his fortune and connections, despite the small army of private investigators he'd employed over the years. As Richard spoke, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph, protected in a waterproof sleeve, worn from years of handling. It showed a baby girl with distinctive amber-colored eyes and a small birthmark on her left shoulder. Maya's breath caught in her throat. She had amber eyes, a rarity that people often commented on. And she had a birthmark on her left shoulder, a small crescent shape she'd always been self-conscious about. But it was the second photograph that made her world tilt on its axis. It showed the baby wearing a locket, delicate gold, with an intricate pattern of roses. With shaking hands, Maya pulled her own locket from beneath her shirt, the only thing she owned from before her life in foster care, the only clue to her past. The patterns matched perfectly, down to the smallest detail. Richard began to sob, reaching for her with trembling hands, and Maya felt 17 years of questions suddenly converging into one impossible, terrifying answer. Maya pulled away from Richard's reaching hands, her mind reeling with the implications of what he was suggesting. It couldn't be true. She couldn't be his daughter, this billionaire's lost child. She was nobody, nothing, just another foster kid who'd fallen through the cracks of a broken system. But even as she denied it internally, she couldn't stop touching the locket around her neck, couldn't stop seeing the identical pattern in his photograph. Father Miguel had returned at the sound of Richard's sobs and now stood in the doorway, his weathered face showing confusion and concern. Richard tried to explain everything through his tears and pain. 17 years ago, his wife Catherine had been home alone with their baby daughter when intruders broke in. They'd been after his valuable art collection, but Catherine had surprised them, and in the ensuing struggle, she'd been killed. The baby had been in her arms, and the thieves had panicked and taken her, perhaps thinking they could use her as leverage or sell her. But no ransom demand ever came. No body was ever found. The investigation had consumed Richard's life, destroying his relationships and nearly bankrupting him emotionally, though his business continued to thrive through sheer momentum. Maya listened with a strange detachment, as if he were telling a story about someone else entirely. She explained her own history, or at least what little she knew of it. She'd been placed with the Hendersons when she was around 2 years old, told she'd been found abandoned at a hospital with no identification except the locket. The Hendersons had been kind people who died in a house fire when she was 14, and she'd run from her next foster placement after experiencing abuse, choosing the streets over the system. She had no memory of anything before the Hendersons, no connection to a previous life or identity. Father Miguel, ever practical, suggested the obvious solution. A DNA test would prove or disprove Richard's theory, would give them certainty instead of speculation based on physical similarities and a matching locket. But Richard shook his head weakly, his face pale from the effort of talking. He said he'd had too many false hopes over the years, too many leads that went nowhere, too many girls presented by con artists trying to claim his fortune. He'd know his daughter by more than genetics, he insisted. He'd know her by her spirit, by something indefinable that he'd been searching for in every young woman's face for 17 years. As Richard spoke with increasing agitation, his wound began bleeding again, seeping through the fresh bandages Father Miguel had applied. The priest gently but firmly insisted that their patient rest, that this conversation could continue after he'd healed, after they'd all had time to process these revelations. But Richard gripped Maya's hand with surprising strength, telling her about her mother, about Catherine's laugh and her kindness, about the nursery they'd prepared with such love and hope. He pulled out his phone, its cracked screen still functional, and showed her pictures. A beautiful woman with amber eyes like Maya's, holding a baby, smiling with pure joy. Maya stared at the images, searching for recognition, for some spark of memory, but found only an aching emptiness where her past should have been. Morning brought Detective Sarah Chen to the church basement, summoned by an anonymous call Father Miguel had made to report a stabbing victim. Richard had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep, and Maya had retreated to a corner, watching everything with wary eyes. The detective was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who took in the scene with practiced assessment: the makeshift medical setup, the homeless girl, the elderly priest, and the unconscious billionaire whose disappearance had apparently triggered a city-wide search. Detective Chen's questions came quickly and precisely. She wanted to know everything about how Maya had found Richard, why she'd brought him here instead of calling for help, what she'd seen in that alley. Maya answered carefully, leaving out nothing but also volunteering nothing extra. She'd learned long ago that the less you said to police, the better, even when you'd done nothing wrong. The detective's eyes kept returning to her face with an expression Maya couldn't quite read, something between suspicion and curiosity. When Richard finally woke, he immediately asked for Maya, his voice stronger after the night's rest, but still strained with pain. Detective Chen's demeanor changed when he began insisting that Maya was his missing daughter, that she'd been returned to him by some miracle or fate. The detective exchanged a glance with Father Miguel that spoke volumes. They'd both seen desperate people grasp at impossible coincidences before. Chen gently suggested that Richard was confused, possibly delirious from trauma and blood loss, but he refused to be dismissed. The detective made calls, and within an hour, Richard's security team arrived, expensive suits and earpieces, moving with military precision. They brought a private doctor who examined Richard and immediately called for an ambulance, overriding his protests. But before they took him away, Richard gave explicit instructions to his head of security, a stern man named Marcus Webb. Maya was to be protected, housed, given everything she needed. Most importantly, arrangements were to be made for DNA testing, the kind that would provide results within hours rather than days. Maya felt like she was watching her life spiral out of her control. Suddenly, she was being asked questions by Richard's lawyers, being offered hotel rooms and new clothes, being treated like someone important instead of invisible. It was overwhelming and frightening in ways the streets had never been. At least on the streets, she knew the rules, knew how to survive. This world of wealth and power and possibility was completely foreign, and she didn't trust it. She especially didn't trust the looks some of Richard's team gave her, calculating expressions that suggested they were already gaming out scenarios where she was either their employer's salvation or the latest in a long line of frauds. Father Miguel became her anchor in the chaos. When she started to panic, overwhelmed by the attention and the implications, he took her aside and reminded her of something important. Whether or not she was Richard's daughter, she had saved a man's life, and that act of courage and compassion defined who she was far more than any DNA test ever could. The priest also warned her gently that if she was Emma Thornton, her life was about to change in ways she couldn't imagine, and she needed to think carefully about what she wanted from this situation. Did she want a family? Could she trust these strangers with money and power? And perhaps most importantly, was she ready to let go of the independence and self-reliance that had kept her alive on the streets? The DNA results came back 36 hours later, delivered to Richard's private hospital room in a sealed envelope. Maya sat in an uncomfortable chair beside his bed, wearing new clothes that felt stiff and strange, her hair washed and trimmed by a stylist who'd been gently horrified by its condition. Richard's recovery had been remarkable, aided by the best medical care money could buy, and now he sat propped up against pillows, his hand trembling as he held the envelope. Marcus Webb stood nearby, his expression professionally neutral, while a lawyer Maya had been introduced to but couldn't remember the name of waited with a tablet ready to document everything. Richard asked if Maya wanted to open it, but she shook her head. Whatever was in that envelope would either confirm an impossible truth or dash an old man's desperate hope. Either way, she wasn't sure she was ready for the answer. So Richard carefully tore open the seal, unfolded the papers inside, and read in silence. Maya watched his face, trying to prepare herself for disappointment, for the moment when this strange dream would end and she'd return to the streets and her cardboard shelter. But instead, Richard's face crumpled, and fresh tears spilled down his cheeks as he looked up at her with an expression of pure joy mixed with overwhelming grief. The test was positive. Probability of paternity, 99.9%. Maya was Emma Catherine Thornton, the daughter who had been stolen 17 years ago, the child Richard had never stopped searching for. The lawyer began speaking rapidly about legal procedures and documentation, about trust funds and inheritance rights, but Maya barely heard any of it. She felt numb, disconnected from her body, as if she were watching this scene happen to someone else. Richard reached for her hand, and this time she didn't pull away, letting him hold it as he wept. The implications crashed over Maya in waves. She had a family, a history, a name that wasn't just a label assigned by social workers. She had a father who had never stopped looking for her, who had spent millions trying to find her, who had kept her nursery exactly as it had been for 17 years, just in case. But she also had a mother she'd never known, murdered by the same people who'd stolen Maya's entire childhood. She had a life that had been taken from her, years of wealth and security and love replaced by foster homes and abuse and finally the streets. Richard wanted to know everything about her life, wanted to fill in the 17 years of blank space, but where could she even begin? How could she tell this kind man, her father, about the times she'd gone days without eating? About the foster father whose hands wandered where they shouldn't? About the nights huddled in the cold, praying she'd wake up in the morning? About the close calls with predators, the constant fear, the grinding poverty that had become her normal? Some stories, Maya realized, couldn't be shared, not because they were secrets, but because they belonged to a different person, a different life that felt increasingly distant. Marcus Webb cleared his throat, bringing them back to practical matters. There would be media attention, he warned, lots of it. The disappearance of Emma Thornton had been a major story 17 years ago, and her miraculous return would make headlines worldwide. They needed to prepare, to control the narrative, to protect Maya from the inevitable circus. There were also security concerns. The people who had taken her were never caught, and while they might be long gone or dead, there could still be danger. Maya would need guards, at least initially, and she'd need to be careful about who she trusted. The penthouse overlooked the city from 60 floors up, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a view that seemed to encompass the entire world. Maya stood at the glass, looking down at the streets she'd walked for years, trying to process the impossible reversal of her circumstances. Just a week ago, she'd been sleeping in a cardboard box. Now she stood in a home that cost more than some small country's GDP, wearing clothes that could have fed her for months, surrounded by more luxury than she'd ever imagined existed. Richard had insisted she stay with him during his recovery, and an entire wing of the penthouse had been prepared for her. Her bedroom was larger than the entire house she'd shared with the Hendersons. The bathroom had heated floors and a shower with more controls than seemed necessary. The closet had been filled with clothes in her size, tags still attached, everything from casual wear to formal gowns she couldn't imagine ever wearing. It was too much, all of it, and Maya found herself retreating to the smallest room in her suite, a walk-in closet, because its confined space felt more comfortable than the cathedral-like bedroom. A team of people had descended on Maya's life with well-meaning intensity. There was Catherine, a social worker specializing in trauma, who wanted to talk about Maya's experiences and help her adjust. There was Dr. Patel, a physician who was appalled by years of inadequate health care and malnutrition and insisted on comprehensive examinations. There was Caroline, Richard's sister and Maya's aunt, an elegant woman in her 50s who kept crying every time she looked at her niece. And there was James, Richard's business partner and oldest friend, who watched Maya with an expression she couldn't quite decipher, something that might have been suspicion or might have been concern. The private tutors came next. Maya had dropped out of school at 14, and while she wasn't uneducated, she taught herself through library books and had significant gaps in formal knowledge. Richard wanted her to have every opportunity, and that meant catching up academically. But the tutors quickly realized that Maya was far more intelligent than her circumstances suggested. She absorbed information rapidly, made connections others missed, and showed particular aptitude for mathematics and logic. What she lacked was polish, the cultural literacy and social skills that came from privilege, and those couldn't be taught as easily as calculus. The hardest part wasn't the luxury or the attention, or even the learning curve. It was trust. Maya had survived by trusting no one but herself, by assuming everyone had an angle, by staying alert for threats and never letting her guard down. Now she was expected to accept help, to believe these people genuinely cared about her welfare, to sleep in an unlocked room and eat food prepared by strangers, and let doctors examine her. Every instinct screamed against it, but she was trying, for Richard's sake if not her own, to adapt to this new reality. She could see how much it meant to him, how her presence was healing wounds he'd carried for 17 years, and she didn't want to hurt him by rejecting everything he offered. The detective's return shattered the fragile peace Maya had been building. Sarah Chen appeared at the penthouse with a file folder and an expression that promised complicated news. The investigation into Richard's stabbing had led them to some connections they hadn't expected, connections to the 17-year-old home invasion and kidnapping. They'd identified Richard's attacker through security footage and forensic evidence, a career criminal named Vincent Reyes who is now in custody. Under interrogation, Reyes had revealed something significant. He'd been hired to attack Richard, specifically because of Maya. The news hit the room like a physical blow. Someone knew that Richard had found his daughter and wanted to stop the reunion, or punish him for it, or perhaps silence Maya before she could remember something dangerous. Detective Chen explained that Reyes wasn't talking about who hired him, but they were working on it. In the meantime, security around both Richard and Maya needed to be significantly increased. The threat was real, immediate, and connected to the original crime that had destroyed their family. Maya's mind raced with implications she hadn't considered. If someone had hired Reyes to attack Richard now, it suggested that the original kidnappers were still active, still invested in keeping secrets buried. But what secrets could a 6-month-old baby possibly have known? Unless it wasn't about what baby Emma had seen, but about what adult Maya might discover or inherit. Richard's fortune was vast, and his business dealings complex. Perhaps the threat wasn't personal but financial, someone who stood to lose if Emma Thornton returned to claim her inheritance. Father Miguel arrived as the meeting was breaking up, having been summoned by Maya through a text message. She needed an anchor, someone from her real life, someone who'd known her before all this began. The priest listened to the developments with his characteristic calm, but Maya could see concern in his eyes. He'd been around long enough to know that money and power attracted predators, and that Maya was now swimming in waters far more dangerous than the streets had ever been. He pulled her aside and spoke quietly, reminding her that she could walk away from all this if she chose, that she didn't owe Richard or anyone else her presence or her risk. But Maya found she didn't want to walk away. The past week had shown her glimpses of what her life might have been, should have been. Richard was genuinely kind, not just playing a role, and he asked nothing of her except her company. She'd met cousins she didn't know she had, seen photographs of her mother, learned about a heritage and history that belonged to her. For the first time in her memory, she felt connected to something larger than mere survival. She wasn't just Maya, the homeless girl, anymore. She was Emma Catherine Thornton, daughter and heir, and she was beginning to think she might want to fight for that identity rather than run from it. The streets had taught her to survive, but maybe it was time to learn how to live. 3 months after the DNA results, Maya stood in St. Catherine's Church, helping Father Miguel organize donations for the homeless shelter. She came back every week, despite Richard's security team's concerns, because this place and these people represented something important. They'd cared about her when she was nobody, when she had nothing to offer in return. Now she used her new resources to help them, funding improvements to the shelter and the clinic, but she also needed to maintain the connection to keep herself grounded in reality. The investigation had concluded with mixed results. They'd identified the men who'd invaded Richard's home 17 years ago, though 2 were dead and 1 was in prison for unrelated crimes, suffering from advanced dementia and useless as a witness. The baby had been sold, they learned, to a couple desperate for a child and willing to ask no questions. That couple, the Hendersons, had genuinely loved Maya and treated her as their own, never knowing she was stolen. The tragedy was that everyone involved in the original crime was dead or imprisoned, except for whoever had hired Vincent Reyes to attack Richard. That person remained unknown, a shadow that security remained vigilant against. But Maya had stopped looking over her shoulder quite so much. She'd learned to navigate her new world, finding a balance between Emma Thornton the heiress and Maya the survivor. She attended private school, excelling in her classes and surprising everyone with her academic performance. She'd made a few friends, carefully chosen people who seemed to value her for herself rather than her father's money. She'd even started therapy, slowly unpacking the trauma of her childhood with Dr. Patel's help, learning that it was okay to be angry about what had been taken from her. Richard had transformed too. Having his daughter back had given him purpose beyond business, beyond the obsessive search that had consumed him. He'd learned about Maya's life on the streets and quietly established a foundation to help homeless youth, building facilities and programs that addressed the real needs she described. He never pressured her to call him dad, accepting whatever she was comfortable with, but Maya had started using the term occasionally, testing it out, finding it fit better than she'd expected. The penthouse had become home, truly home, in a way Maya had never experienced. Her room no longer felt too large, just comfortable. She'd personalized it with art and books, photographs of Father Miguel and the friends she'd made at the shelter alongside pictures of Richard and her mother. The locket that had connected her past and present hung on her wall in a shadow box, a reminder of the journey that had brought her here. She'd faced danger and doubt, suspicion and threat, but she'd also found something she'd been searching for without knowing it, a place where she belonged, a name that was truly hers, and a family that would never stop fighting for her. On the anniversary of the night she'd found Richard bleeding in that alley, Maya stood on the penthouse balcony watching the sunset paint the city in gold and amber, colors that matched her eyes. Behind her, she heard Richard approaching, his footsteps still slightly uneven from his injury, but growing stronger every day. He stood beside her in comfortable silence, 2 people who'd lost everything and somehow found each other. Maya reached out and took his hand, and for the first time in her 17 years of life, she felt complete. The streets had taught her to survive, but love, she was learning, taught you how to truly live. And this was only the beginning of Emma Catherine Thornton's real story.